Da.
Mislim, mene je tražio YouTube već nekakve potvrde, tako da sam ja poklikao masu toga.
Dobro.
Evo ga, radi stream.
Hello everyone and welcome to the first ever online workshop of the Second World War Research, the Balkans regional group. I'm glad to see that there are people following this, and hopefully more would eventually join us. My name is Jurica Barić. I am an MA student at the University of Zagreb, and I'll moderate this workshop and also give a paper a little bit later. Now, before we begin, I'm sorry to inform you that Professor Stojanović was unable to join us today, but she agreed on filming her paper, which we will upload onto this channel in due time, probably Thursday, so you'll be able to see it. Now, to present the first speaker of the day, it's Professor Goran Hutinec. He teaches modern history at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here in Zagreb, and he is an expert in pretty much everything regarding World War II in these parts. Especially, he's the expert in the fascist Ustaša regime and the independent state of Croatia, or as it's called here, the NDH, or Nezavisna država Hrvatska. Professor Hutinec will now present a paper on the camp system and the Holocaust on the territory of the independent state of Croatia, or NDH. But before he joins us, just to make a short introduction, I actually believe that giving such an overview might prove interesting to all of you, but also I believe that Western and also Eastern society by this day remains quite unfamiliar with the true extent of the persecutions, the executions, and finally the terrible aftermath of the infamous Ustaša regime. So the main reason that led me to believe this actually was my recent visit to the Imperial War Museum in London last summer, where they gave an incredible exhibition on the Holocaust. However, there was a map of Europe on the wall, and they put on the map all concentration and death camps organized by both the German Nazi and other fascist collaborator and puppet states. So when it came to the independent state of Croatia, only Jasenovac was shown on the map, as I recall, and they mentioned it as a minor concentration camp, which is not exactly right. There were even over 50 different locations, probably not all describable as camps, but still those were the locations where Ustaša regime gathered their victims and staged mass executions, mostly by knife, but also by other means. So Jasenovac says the worst of them became most infamous. All of those camps, as well as the beginning of the Holocaust and overall genocide on the territory of the independent state of Croatia, is what Professor Hutinec is going to talk about. And now I give the word to Professor Hutinec. Enjoy his lecture.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Nice to meet you, even though I can't really see you, but I hope to have a fruitful presentation, and later I can even answer any questions if you might have them. I would just add regarding the resources, there is a recent publication on various concentration camps run by German allies, including Independent State of Croatia, published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and I think it's available online, and you can expand your knowledge on this subject by checking that resource. Of course, it's a topic that really isn't easy to present on in such a short time span. I think that's a subject that could be talked about for an entire semester, and well, I hope we'll manage with the time that's available to us. So to start with the introduction regarding the Ustaša regime itself, it was actually established in April 1941 after attack by the Axis powers on Yugoslavia and its defeat. Well, actually, this attack was staged after a coup in Yugoslavia itself, which enraged Hitler, who was at that time actively preparing the Barbarossa campaign, and he wanted to have his flanks clear of any disturbances, and he was already planning a joint attack against Italy in order to against Greece, together with his Italian allies, in order to avoid any possible complication in the Balkan area. In order to achieve that, he tried to persuade various Balkan nations to join the Axis, and he actually succeeded with Hungary, with Romania, with Bulgaria, and eventually with Kingdom of Yugoslavia. However, in March 1941, however, only a few days later, there was a coup by the Yugoslav military, which had shown Hitler that he can't really rely on Yugoslavia as an ally, and that's when he decided to basically not just attack and conquer Yugoslavia, but also to dissolve it as a state. In order to do that, he and his allies had to have men on the ground, someone who could be relied on, someone who could, in a way, act as a organization that would make sure that there are no similar disturbances in the future in that area. There were several possible candidates for Croatian part of Yugoslavia. The first German choice was actually the most influential politician of that time, the leader of Croatian Peasant Party, Vlatko Maček, but he declined German offers, and as a second candidate, Italians actually organized or helped Pavelić and his Ustaše to establish a regime and independent state of Croatia. Pavelić and this Ustaša organization was actually considered as a terrorist and not just considered, it was a terrorist organization established in the 1930s in order to fight against Yugoslav state, and their goal, as they proclaimed it, was at first the establishment of an independent Croatian state, but later with time they started to include more and more of these fascist elements in their ideology, including anti-Semitism. So at first the main enemy of Ustaša movement and therefore also of the Ustaša regime when they established a state in April 1941 were Serbs as some sort of a main element that controlled the Yugoslav state before the April War. In addition to that, they also started including sometimes in mid-1930s Jews as enemies, but also Freemasons, communists, all those elements that were considered undesirable, unwanted in this new national free Croatian state. Of course, they led a harsh life while they were living in the emigration. They were most of them, including Pavelić, were actually wanted men by the Yugoslav regime. And after a successful assassination of Yugoslav King Alexander in Marseille in 1934, even Italy, that was their main supporter at that time, started to impose pretty harsh restrictions on their activities, which also meant that many of them were interned in Italy at the outbreak of Second World War in Yugoslav areas. So that meant that Pavelić couldn't be at the location or in Croatia itself at the start of the war. He actually arrived some 5 days after the official proclamation of the independent state of Croatia, which happened on April 10th, 1941. And as soon as he, with his most fervent supporters, returned, not just from Italy, but also from other states like Hungary, like Germany, where they lived in exile, they started to impose a very harsh regime, which was supposed to ensure not just complete control of the state by the Ustaša movement or Ustaša regime, but also which had to it had to ensure that their long-term goals would be effectively introduced. As I already said, their main ideological ground was anti-Serbianism. So once they established the independent state of Croatia, once they were accepted by the Nazi Germany, by the fascist Italy, but also by other surrounding members of the Axis alliance as a newly formed independent state, once the borders were defined, where the biggest problem was actually defining the border with Italy, but also with other surrounding neighboring countries, they actually received, or they were given a state which was very far from this homogenic Croatian ideal. So out of some 6 million inhabitants, over 2 million were not Croatian. So it was a very complex, ethnically not homogeneous state, and one of the first tasks that Ustaša wanted to achieve or to promote was ethnic change, or change in the ethnic composition of their state. In order to achieve that, they had to introduce various legal regulations, which were usually not created as laws by the parliament, since it had no parliament until early 1942. It was basically a totalitarian dictatorship in which the head of the state and the head of the Ustaša movement, Ante Pavelić, who was called poglavnik, or a leader by his supporters, and who basically had the final say in all such matters. So most of the regulation that defined who is to be targeted, who is to be imprisoned or sent to concentration camps, it was all decided at the head of the state and at the head of the Ustaša movement in office of Ante Pavelić. First such regulations were introduced already a few days after he returned to Zagreb. They basically introduced a regulation that allowed them to prosecute anyone who defiled the honor of Croatian nation. It was not defined. This crime was not really defined, and it enabled Ustaša to basically target anyone they wanted. Only weeks later, they introduced racial laws. These laws were introduced at the end of April, and it's interesting to say, but the first concentration camp in independent state of Croatia was already in action at that time, but it took some time for the bureaucracy, which was largely inherited from previous Kingdom of Yugoslavia, from the previous state. So this bureaucracy had to take some time in order to connect the dots and continue working in some sort of peaceful manner. And basically they took the Nuremberg laws from Germany, they translated it, but introduced some smaller changes into it. For example, the Roma were defined as un-Aryan from the start. So there was no delay in this as it was case in Germany. the main groups, ethnic or national groups that were targeted, or racial groups that were targeted by this law, by these laws, were primarily Jews and Roma. It's interesting to say, but Serbs were actually not mentioned in the racial laws, and the reason for that is basically because, according to the most prominent racial scientists of that period, there wasn't really that much of a difference between Croats and Serbs. There were theories that Croats are actually a group descending from Goths, but this was very murky even at that time, and most people actually accepted that there is no significant racial difference between Croats and Serbs. However, that didn't mean that they were that the Serbs were not targeted by institutions and by organizations which were created in order to uphold these racial laws. Of course, before I start my presentation on concentration camps in the independent state of Croatia, it is necessary to say that concentration camps were not the only means of persecution. Already in first weeks of after the establishment of independent state of Croatia, Ustaše started organizing special tribunals, which had power to summarily sentence any enemy of the state, even sentences even that sentence was actually quite normal and expected. And many of individuals who were actively opposing Ustaše, or those that were known to be important or influential in the pre-war period, especially those that were loyal to the state, to Yugoslavia, fell victim to these special courts. Most of larger cities in independent state of Croatia actually had such courts, and this was sort of a way of dealing with dissenters in urban areas. Parallelly, Ustaše also started brutal persecution in rural areas, which was aimed primarily against the Serbs. There were several attempts or several ways to deal with this perceived Serbian danger. One possible solution was deportation. Since German Wehrmacht was controlling Serbia proper, there was an agreement between German officials and Ustaše in the independent state of Croatia, which regulated this forceful expulsion of Serbs from Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina to Serbia. In order to achieve this, the Ustaše had to accept a German plan to deport the same number of Slovenians from the areas of Yugoslavia that were directly annexed to Third Reich, which is primarily northern Slovenia areas around the city of Maribor. This was one possibility. However, in addition to these legal expulsions, if I may call it that way, there were also illegal expulsions, primarily in areas neighboring Serbia. So we estimate that tens of thousands of Serbs fled and actually were able to survive by fleeing from independent state of Croatia. A second possibility, which gained traction, especially in later stages of the war, was forced change of religion. Namely, Orthodox Serbs were forced to accept Catholicism, which was considered as some sort of a way for them to stop being Serbian and start being more Croatian. This was, of course, usually used when the Ustaše were not strong enough in a certain area, when they felt that some sort of a compromise was needed in areas where they couldn't really enter and basically massacre and everyone, which was, in my opinion, the most favored outcome for them, since this third and the most brutal way of dealing with Serbs was the policy of extermination, of mass murders, which usually took part in rural areas. They started with mass executions of Serbian males already in late April, and continued throughout May. And in June, especially after the start of Operation Barbarossa, when Ustaše themselves perceived this as a chance, as an opportunity to finish this bloody business in a way which would be basically outshined by these things that were happening in Eastern Europe, and they thought that this German attack against Soviet Union was a blessing, since it allowed them to do such mass atrocities without any sort of control from outside. And since July 1941, they stepped up these massacres, and they started persecuting also women and children, which, in my opinion, was the point in time when we can actually prove that they really started a genocidal practice, or that they attempted to exterminate the Serbian population from independent state of Croatia. While all this was happening, the concentration camps were being organized. The first of them in the northwestern Croatia, an abandoned chemical factory near the city of Koprivnica. The name of the factory was Danica, and this is how we usually call that concentration camp today. It was established, as I said, already in late April 1941, and it continued its operation for almost 2 years. Unlike other later concentration camps, this was not the number of victims isn't that high. There were over 6,000 inmates that went through this camp, but we have evidence of about 30 victims, 30 people killed in the camp itself, mostly through beatings, which were normal, especially in the first stages of its operation. However, it was quite clear to Ustaše that this area was too close to the Hungarian border. They probably feared possible escapes, especially because they had strained relationship with Hungarian government over territorial disputes. And in May of 1941, they decided to establish another camp, which soon evolved into a full-fledged camp system. It was in area around Gospić, the city of Gospić, which was used as a transit point, as a collection camp of sorts, where inmates were sent, or prisoners were sent from all over the independent state of Croatia. They would arrive to Gospić, and they would usually there be separated. Those that were considered as most dangerous, usually young males, were sent to a nearby Velebit mountain, where the first camp, which can be considered as a death camp, was established at a place called Jadovno. So it's not, it wasn't really inhabited. It was a collection of barracks erected in forest of the Velebit Mountains, and almost no survivors are known from that camp. Only a handful were able to escape, and one smaller group was actually used as young Jews were used as for sweeping the streets at Gospić, and basically survived Jadovno because they were away. They were in Gospić when the camp itself was liquidated and all the inmates murdered. There are various estimates regarding the number of people killed there. the lowest being around 12,000 people, and the higher ones going as much as over 40,000. In addition to Jadovno, there were also two other camps erected on the nearby island of Pag in the Adriatic Sea. People would usually be driven by cars or even forced to walk all the way over this Velebit mountain to the coast, where they were embarked in smaller boats and then driven or taken to this island of Pag. At first, there were separate camps for males and females, but they were later joined. And many of the people or inmates in that camp were treated very brutally. This was August with intense heat. They didn't receive enough food or water, and many groups were taken during nights from the camp and then murdered and simply thrown into sea. This camp system also had some other smaller sub-camps. For example, the building which housed the local county jail in Gospić itself, but also the local cinema and even a local sheep farm. However, these other sub-camps were far less brutal than those aforementioned, Jadovno, Metena, and Slana. The legal pretext for deportations was actually given in late June, a few days after the start of Operation Barbarossa, and the only group that was specifically targeted by this proclamation were Jews. However, that didn't stop the Ustaša regime from sending or treating Serbs and other political prisoners to the same camps. During that time, when these camps were operating, many of the inmates were actually transferred from the first camp, from Danica, and most of them killed at Gospić or Jadovno or those other sub-camps. And all the while, this was happening in the surrounding areas, which were predominantly Serbian. There were these large-scale pogroms, massacres by the Ustaša militia, and in late July, it triggered a massive response, an uprising, which was predominantly Serbian, or this rural Serbian population took part in it. But already in the first stages of this uprising, many Yugoslav or Croatian communists also joined, and this was some sort of a stepping stone for the establishment of partisan movement in Yugoslavia and in Croatia, particularly. Because of this uprising, which took this area by surprise, which actually stopped or it forced Ustaše to stop with those atrocities in certain areas. It also gave a pretext to Italians who were nearby in the areas that were directly annexed to Italy after the April War, and the Italian army decided to reoccupy entire southern half of independent state of Croatia in order to achieve some sort of pacification. This Gospić area was also decided to be reoccupied by Italians, and we actually know we have documents from Italian military that describe what they found at Pag Island at these Metena and Slana concentration camp. They actually exhumated over 700, nearly 800 corpses, including many women and children. It was clear that Italians wouldn't tolerate such policies in the areas under their occupation, and Ustaše had to find some other place. And this is when they started experimenting. At first, they used various transit camps that were used for internment of political opposition already before the war. For example, Kruščica location in northern or northwestern Bosnia, which was used for internment of undesirables even before the war, but was now for a short period of time also used as a concentration camp. In addition to that, sanatorium in a castle in northern Croatia at a village called Lobor was also used as a concentration camp, and most of the women and children, predominantly Jewish women and children that survived Gospić, and those camps were actually transferred to this area, which continued to operate for an entire year until the remaining inmates were, in accordance with Nazi Germany, were altogether transported and murdered at Auschwitz in occupied Poland. Regarding men that survived this Gospić concentration camp system, Ustaše had to find some other solution, and they chose a location in central Croatia near Sava River, which is today at the border between Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, a place called Jasenovac, which had, it wasn't really a big city, we might call it a town, smaller town. There was a brick factory owned by a Serbian family which fled and rescued themselves by fleeing to Serbia. Ustaše took over this brickworks, this brick factory, and established a new camp there. This was actually the third location. Two previous locations, which were outside the town itself, were soon deemed unsuitable because of the flooding in that area in late fall of 1941. So Jasenovac number 1 and Jasenovac camp number 2, subcamp number 2, were in operation for a short period of time, only a few months, and after that the Ustaše discontinued further operation and took all remaining survivors to this so-called Jasenovac 3 brickworks, which was for the remainder of war the main location, the main concentration camp in the independent state of Croatia. This Jasenovac concentration camp system was really a system. It wasn't just one location. They soon, the Ustaše soon realized that they could put many of the inmates or prisoners capable of work, that they could put them to some use for them, and especially in the neighboring villages. Many of those villages were Serbian, where Ustaše either murdered the inhabitants or forced them to, or transported them to Germany as forced labor. The farms that remained behind were soon put into operation, but the inmates were working there. In addition to that, there were other camps established by other organizations. For example, in the city of Đakovo in Slavonia, local authorities established a concentration camp in which mostly Jews were imprisoned. It was later also used as a place where many of the Jews from Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially from the city of Sarajevo, which was the second largest Jewish settlement in independent state of Croatia, were also taken to. This Đakovo camp was taken over by Jasenovac's administration in early 1942, and the remaining survivors were then sometimes in May or June or even early July taken in several transports to Jasenovac and murdered at that site. In addition to that, an old prison at Stara Gradiška, which was in operation already during Habsburg rule, several hundred years before Second World War, Ustaše also established another subcamp, which was mainly used to imprison political prisoners and women, and which was in certain aspects as brutal as Jasenovac, but on the other hand, it was also used as a collection point, as a place where they chose inmates who were deemed fit to work, and which were then, in cooperation with German officials, especially with Operation Todd, sent either to Germany or to other occupied areas as far as occupied Norway. This aspect of concentration camps in independent state of Croatia was most likely learned from German Nazi concentration camps. Namely, the head of this department, which was controlling all concentration camps in independent state of Croatia, the so-called Ustaša Defense, or Office 3 of the Ustaša Surveillance Service. His name was Vjekoslav Max Luborić. He was actually sent to Germany and spent several weeks at the Oranienburg-Sachsenhausen concentration camp system near Berlin. So in many ways, we see at Jasenovac system sometimes in late 1941 and later many of the influences from this German concentration camp system, especially in the organization of working details and such things. However, in addition to this working or forced labor that took part in Jasenovac and other camps, this area was also an execution site where mass murders took place already in late 1941 and all the way throughout the remainder of the war until April 1945, when Jasenovac's concentration camp was disestablished after the successful breakout by the surviving inmates at the end of the war. The place where most of the mass execution took part was on the other side of the river, since this concentration camp had one side at Sava River itself. Ustaše usually took those inmates that were selected for murder, or even those that never went into camp. There were many transports that were taken over to the other side of the Sava River to a location called Gradina in today's Bosnia and Herzegovina, where most numerous atrocities took part. They were taken over in smaller groups, up to several hundred people, tied up, and then taken to the mass graves and murdered there, at first with firearms, but later with mallets, with knives, in a most brutal way. In addition to that, as I already mentioned, several of neighboring villages were also taken over by Ustaše. The inhabitants were either forced to relocate or imprisoned or murdered. One such place, a village of Uštica, was used in the spring of 1942 to deal with the Roma. The Roma in independent state of Croatia were, as I already mentioned, also targeted by the racial laws, just like the Jews also, because they were deemed as un-Aryan. At first, in 1941, there were no organized expulsions or mass murders committed against Roma. However, in the spring, in May of 1942, without any sort of order from outside, from Germany or any other place, the Ustaše started the extermination of the entire Roma population in the independent state of Croatia. They chose this village of Uštica near Jasenovac to concentrate many of them. Some were killed immediately upon arrival, and throughout the summer of 1942, most of the Roma population in independent state of Croatia was exterminated. Only several hundred people survived, usually by escaping to other neighboring states or by hiding or joining the resistance. In a way, this genocide against Roma was the most successful part of this genocidal practice undertaken by the Ustaše. Jews were also persecuted very diligently. Just like in the case of Roma, there is no evidence of any sort of order given by Germans or any sort of German involvement in the decision to start mass murder of Jewish population in independent state of Croatia. However, after the Wannsee conference in early 1942, the Germans offered their assistance, even though over a half of the Jewish population of independent state of Croatia was already imprisoned or murdered by then. The Ustaše took this help and organized several transports to Auschwitz. First 5 transport with somewhere around 5,000 victims was deported in August 1942, and the remaining 2 transports were sent in May of 1943. The last transport in 1942 also included the already mentioned women and children imprisoned at Lobograd concentration camp. In order to organize these deportations in a more quick and efficient way, Ustaše at that time established several transit camps. The most well-known of these was transit camp at Tenja village near the city of Osijek, and only a handful of survivors remained from these transport. Many were either murdered upon arrival to Auschwitz, or were killed as inmates in later weeks and later months. Out of some 40,000 Jews that lived in the areas under Ustaše control at the beginning of April of 1941, and this was around 40,000 people, less than 7,000 survived the war, most of them either by fleeing. Many fled actually to the areas occupied by Italian army, since Italy didn't assist the Ustaše and Nazis in organization of these transports. These refugees, as they were called by Italians, were interned in several camps that were established throughout the Adriatic littoral. Some of them even in Italy proper, or Italy in borders which it had before the outbreak of the war. However, most of them were interned at the island of Rab, where a special internment camp was already working, in which many Slovenes and Croats, supporters of resistance, were imprisoned. And this is one of the more heroic, one might say, episodes in Jewish history in Croatia. Namely, many of the Jews that were interned at Rab joined the resistance after the surrender of Italy in September of 1943. They even established a separate Jewish battalion, several hundred men strong, men and women, and they joined the partisans after the Italian capitulation. And this is, I think, one of the most numerous units organized by by Jews and joining the resistance during the Second World War. Of course, even after these larger transports to Nazi camps in Auschwitz and other places, there were other smaller deportations on individual basis, and some of the refugees that fled from independent state of Croatia were later recaptured by Germans in other areas. For example, those that tried to flee to Switzerland were sometimes captured and then deported together with Jews from Italy. Many tried to save themselves by escaping to Hungary, but were later captured and deported to Auschwitz and other areas in 1944 after the German invading troops occupied Hungary. So there wasn't really a good choice for these people, even though some Jews were deemed as honorary Aryans, mostly those that were useful, either because they were physicians, doctors, or if they had connections, or if they could pay a bribe and rescue themselves in that way. However, this is a minority of only a minority of Jews could really take that path. And out of 40,000 people that Jews that lived in the independent state of Croatia, over 33,000 were killed. Most of them by the Ustaše, either in direct mass murders or in many cases in these concentration camps, and somewhat over 7,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazis after they were handed over by the Ustaše. But in all of those cases, it was always after the Wannsee Conference. So there is really no evidence that Germans, that the Nazis persuaded the Ustaše to start with this policy. We might say that it was an autonomous decision, just like the decision to start the genocide against the Roma. In addition to camps that I already mentioned, there were other smaller sub-camps. Many of those were used even before the war, in some cases to house Jewish refugees from Central Europe, especially after Anschluss in 1938. Over 2,000 Jews or foreign Jews were still in Croatia at the outbreak of April War in 1941. People who didn't manage to obtain passports or visas and couldn't go abroad. Many of them were captured by Ustaše or by Germans and murdered in independent state of Croatia or sent to Nazi camps. In some cases, even in the later stages of the war, Ustaše established new camps. The most well-known case was the prison of Lepoglava in northern Croatia. This prison, which was used to house many political prisoners, members of the resistance, was attacked and liberated by the partisan units in summer of 1943. After they retreated together with the rescued compatriots, the partisans torched the entire, or put to flame the entire area of the prison. However, it was later recaptured by Ustaše, and they established a sub-camp. They basically sent guards from a guard detachment from Jasenovac in order to establish a new sub-camp there, even though it was quite far away from the main camp at Jasenovac, and it continued to operate almost until the end of the war. During during late 1942, we must also stress the attempts by the German military to calm down the Ustaše, because they understood that these brutal practices were actually helping the resistance. They were basically recruiting new recruits for the resistance simply by existing these concentration camps, and therefore, after a series of very brutal mass murders committed by Ustaše in Srijem area, which is at the eastern part of the independent state of Croatia, they decided to act, and they forced Ustaše to remove the worst offenders, one might say. And therefore, after the end of 1942, there was a period of relative calm in many of the Ustaše concentration camps, including Jasenovac. It lasted for over a year until mid-1944. However, there were still individual murders committed or mistreatment of prisoners, and this German involvement was actually also motivated by attempts to ensure or increase the numbers of forced laborers sent to Germany. Basically, they even organized or established an Operation Todd unit in the town of Jasenovac, which could in situ select prisoners and then send them to work in German factories. In order to deport these people, they usually had to go to quarantine, and many of them actually were sent not directly to Germany, but rather to Semlin or Zemun camp, which was under German control at that time, where they had to undergo quarantine. However, in some cases, many were deemed as unfit to work and were basically sent back by the Germans from Zemun. There is the most brutal of such instances was one transport that was sent back to Jasenovac from Zemun by Germans in late August 1942, with over 5,000 inmates who were murdered in next several days upon arrival at Jasenovac. So there were also numerous attempts to escape from this camp and from other camps also, but those that didn't succeed were usually murdered, and of course also other who were considered as who were thought by Ustaše to be dangerous or trying to organize an escape. They would also be selected and murdered individually, even during this period of relative calm. The Ustaše administration of Jasenovac had the policy of murdering any inmate above 3,000. So basically, they needed around 3,000 people to work in those industries that were erected in Jasenovac's camp system. However, mostly at winter, when there was no need for workers at surrounding farms, many inmates would be considered as useless eaters and simply murdered, usually at Gradina. And one might say that this period between 1943 and 1944 was a time when Ustaše actually were more driven by security concerns, especially because the resistance was at that time already so strong that they couldn't continue this genocidal policy, especially against Serbian population, that they started in 1941, and they therefore started to rethink their position. They even removed some of the worst offenders, including people at the top of the state and Ustaše political hierarchy. However, as the ending of the war was nearing, in late 1944, they once again restarted the most brutal policies, and the number of people killed in the Ustaše prison system and concentration camp system again started to rise. Jasenovac, which was the main concentration camp site in independent state of Croatia, was also a place where most of the victims of this camp system were murdered. And at the end of the war, in April 1945, the Ustaše started to eradicate the evidence of these mass murders. They started to search for mass graves from 1941-1942 period. They started excavating the graves and burning the remains or corpses that were still there. Of course, they couldn't finish their work because the war ended before that. And some of the survivors testify of the methods that they used. And in many cases, these methods were actually almost identical to the methods used by by the Nazis in the so-called Action 1005. And in my opinion, there had to be some sort of personal connection, some sort of transfer of knowledge, even though we still don't have any factual or any documentary evidence that would support this thesis. Jasenovac's camp system was abandoned by Ustaše in late April 1945. The main reason for that was not just the forces of Yugoslav army approaching, but also the inmate uprising, which took part on April 22nd, 1945, after the remaining 800 or 900 prisoners saw what was happening, after they saw that many groups were taken to the grave sites and never returned, and after the liquidation of the female sub-camp of Jasenovac, they decided to stage an uprising, and they attacked the guards and started running and jumping over the fences. In the ensuing chaos, most of them were murdered. However, over 90 people actually survived and could testify regarding their experience after the war. Many of them being veterans, so to say, not only of the Jasenovac camp, but also other camps, since Ustaše usually relocated prisoners, and many of them actually went through several camps before they were either murdered or released or rescued. So I can conclude here and respond to questions.
Well, that was an interesting lecture. Thank you very much, Professor Hutinec. And we have some questions that came in a bit earlier.
Yes.
So the first, let me just open them. Yeah, apologize to everyone, since for some reason we cannot accept questions via live chat on this stream. So we'll
have to trust you.
Our email via SWWRG Balkan@gmail.com. So we have actually two questions by Jonathan Fennell, who's a lecturer at the King's College of London. And the first question is, to what extent did the population of the independent state of Croatia know about the Holocaust? And the second question is, what proportion of state spending in the independent state of Croatia was devoted to the Holocaust?
Oh, the second one is pretty tough. I'm not really sure that we can answer it right now, since this research is something that is still ongoing. We know for a fact that Holocaust in independent state of Croatia was actually funding itself, since already at the beginning summer of 1941, Ustaše established a so-called Office for Economic Renewal, which its main task was basically to repurpose or to take under state control or to nationalize the properties taken away from the victims of the genocide. Not just the Jews, but also Serbs, and in later stages also of Roma. Of course, even until the end of the war, they didn't go through all the facts. They estimated, Ustaše themselves estimated after the war that they took over around 50 billion dinars. I'm not sure what was the equivalent in Reichmarks or pounds or dollars, but quite a substantial sum. Out of this, around 10% was actually put to some use, around 5 billion dinars. And I think we can connect this answer with the previous question regarding the extent the population knew about the Holocaust. Many of the regular, ordinary citizens of independent state of Croatia actually profiteered from Holocaust and therefore had to, or in my opinion, had a chance to inform themselves about the Holocaust. So, for example, let me just give you one concrete example. In the city of Varaždin in northern Croatia, which also housed barracks of Croatian legionary regiment that was sent to fight in Eastern Front and which met its demise in Stalingrad in 1942. The local authorities even created lists of people who are deserving, people who could be given some property taken away from the Jews. And at the beginning of this list were usually volunteers who joined this so-called Croatian Legion that was sent and fought at the Eastern Front. After them, the usual suspects, many of the local Ustaša officials, which also took a chance and enriched themselves through this process. And at the end were usually poorer people who were, of course, often given smaller amounts of money or some utensils or clothes or boots and smaller things. So many had the opportunity to inform themselves of the Holocaust. I'm not really sure if all of them knew already in 1941 that these mass deportations also meant death for people who fell victim to this practice. However, I think that by later stages of the war, until let's say sometimes in summer of 1942, most of the population knew what was happening, and they could hear about these Ustaše activities, not just about mass murders in the villages committed against Serbs, but also what was going on in the camps, because most of these camps, excluding Jadovno, were actually near inhabited places. So there were civilians, if I may call them that way, Croatian civilians living of several hundred or several thousand meters from the camp fence. So, in my opinion, most of the population could, if they wanted, could find out about what was going on. I'm not so sure about the transports to German-run camps. In most cases, the people knew where these transports were headed. There are numerous documents referring to Schlesien or even Oswiecim or Auschwitz as a final destination of these transports. However, I'm not really sure that they had a chance to really find out about what was happening there until the remaining survivors returned after the end of the war. Of course, the resistance also took use of these camps. They used them as a propaganda tool because some of the escapees actually joined the resistance. There was one smaller group that escaped Jasenovac in early 1942 and joined the partisan units in Bosnia, and they could testify about the things that they experienced during their stay in Jasenovac, and it was used in propaganda by the resistance. So, in my opinion, there was really a large percentage of population actually knew of what was going on.
And just to add a little bit to Professor Hutinec's response, 100 Croatian kuna equaled to 5 Reichsmarken, which was the same as the Serbian dinar. But it's interesting that 100 Soviet rubley was worth 47.2 Reichsmarken, and the highest value was the one of the British pound, for which 100 pounds was worth 991 Reichsmarken.
What about dollar? American dollar? US dollar? What about
US dollar? I'm not quite sure. It was weaker than the pound. It was around 290 Reichsmark, $100.
So 50 billion kunas, that's quite a large amount.
Actually, yeah.
And of course, I didn't mention what happened with other belongings, the factories, the industrial enterprises, even smaller enterprises were nationalized and basically sold to people interested in buying them. So that was also a way to that was used as a way to support the state budget of the independent state of Croatia. And the same thing happened to the apartments and houses, which were also nationalized by selling. And of course, they usually, the Ustaše regime usually asked for a smaller price than was really the real value of such places in order to promote this Aryanization policy, which also, I think, was very important in creating the acceptance of this regime. And many of the people who joined Ustaše ranks were perhaps not primarily, but to some extent motivated by this desire to profit financially from the Holocaust.
Thank you, Professor Hutinec, for this lecture. As far as I can see, we have no more questions at the moment. I am taking care of it, but that's it regarding questions. Anyways, it was awesome.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll hear more from you in our future events, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. I'll be glad to join you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we're moving to Belgrade. Unfortunately, again, Professor Stojanović was not able to join us today, so we're missing her paper on topics similar to those Professor Hutinec spoke of, but in the context of Serbian historiography. However, I believe the paper will be available on this channel in short time. I mentioned Thursday earlier, so I believe Thursday is going to be. But anyways, we're moving to Belgrade, where a colleague and dear friend of mine, Vukašin Zorić from University of Belgrade, awaits us.
That's me.
So an MA student, and he'll talk about modern negationism in Serbia. And before he starts his paper, I would love to make a short introduction into the topic. So those of you who even remotely follow the political situation in the Balkans are probably more or less familiar with it. And today we'll mostly focus on concerning rise of fascist, that is, extreme right tendencies in Croatia and Serbia. As it is, we're witnessing a rise of similar tendencies throughout the world, but I'm here to say, unfortunately, the Croatian case is one of the worst. Most of all because of the terrible legacy of the Vukašin regime, which was especially terrible, as you already heard by Professor Hutinec. And as for the case of Serbia, I think that colleague Vukašin will also agree. It cannot be characterized as fascist, as the Serbian people suffered a lot by those fascist policies in the past. But its extreme nationalism resembles such a pattern. It all started a few years before the war in Yugoslavia. So we're looking at somewhere around the end of the 80s. We're trying to show now is how two completely different nationalistic policies led by modern Croatian and Serbian officials and also the societies treat the legacy of World War II resistance, which is known as the partisans or the NOB, Narodno-oslobodilačka borba, in practically the same way. Vukašin, you're on, and good luck.
Thank you very much. I want to say just that Professor Stojanović and I have already scheduled the filming of her paper for Thursday at 10 a.m., so everything will be prepared. Jurica.
Sorry. Sorry.
Jurica tried to censor my microphone, but I think
we tend to do that a lot.
Hear each other now. So I will talk about historical revisionism that is nowadays popular thing in Serbian historiography, and I will not criticize the idea of revision in history, which is needed on every topic, but the ideological revisionism that wants to alter history in order to benefit nationalistic political goals, either clearly stating it or hiddenly stating it. So I will firstly make a short introduction on the coverage of the NOB, the partisan liberation war in the Serbian public during the socialist era during the 90s, and then the focus of my paper will be to speak on the revisionism in history, in judicial scene, and in the public sphere in Serbian 21st century. So let's just start, because my personal topic of interest is the memory and the politics of memory of socialist Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1990, all the alterations during that period. We can say that in that period there was a cultural and memorial monopoly of the alliance of organizations of veterans called SUBNOR, which gathered all the partisans that participated in the Liberation Army and in the resistance movement of in the World War II. They were the creators and executions and the executors of those politics of memory, and the World War II was deemed as the most important topic in the newly formed socialist state, and as a vital part of the new socialist history that was to build a new socialist society. But then in the 1990s, when the war broke out and the new nationalist narrative broke from the bottoms of society, there was actually there was not such a rise in historiographical revisionism, but the journalists were the forerunners and the pioneers of historical revisionism in Serbia. So a lot of journalists started to have interviews with Chetnik emigration, with Nedić emigration. They started to make estimates on various topics. For example, they started with over-exaggeration of Jasenovic's victims, of victims of post-war communist regime in the period of 1944 to 1948. But interestingly enough, the state-run and state-sponsored historical revisionism started when Slobodan Milošević actually fell, because Milošević, even though a nationalistic figure, was a leader of party, Socialist Party of Serbia, which was founded by a merger of the Communist League of Serbia and the Socialist Association of the Working People of Serbia in 1990. So he couldn't openly promote this idea that would be deemed by ex-communists as revisionist. So these democratic changes did bring some good things into the Serbian public sphere, but also gave the public open space to new and politically motivated readings of the history of the World War II in Serbia. So I would now like to list the three parties involved in the World War II and the three modi in which they are presented in revisionist nationalist historiography that is not only presented in rogue journals like it was before, but is now infiltrated in some parts of the academia as well. First of all, I'd like to talk about the Chetnik side. For those who are unfamiliar with that, Chetniks, or the Yugoslav army in the fatherland, were the remnants of Yugoslav army that was destroyed in the April War of 1941 after the German invasion, that refused the capitulation of Yugoslavia and continued to resist the German occupation. Their uprising started in May of 1941, and their leader was Dragoljub Draža Mihajlović, who later in that year became the Minister of War of the Yugoslav government in exile in London. But there is the most prominent revisionistic theme is to present, and this is already in Serbian high school and primary school textbooks of in history, that in Serbia there were two anti-fascist movements, the Chetniks and the partisans. This is the most well grounded in the public sphere narrative. So I'd like to argue, as the other historians who follow this revisionist topic, that Chetniks were not either even in 1941 they were not anti-fascists. Rather, we can call them anti-occupationist, anti-German, because they never ideologically condemned fascism. Neither they have said that the fascism is their enemy. They have rather said that those who occupy Yugoslavia are their enemy. Another example to support this distinction between anti-fascism and anti-occupational operations is that the Chetniks have openly said that they are against an ideology, not fascism, but communism. Chetniks were, from the start to the finish of the war, anti-communist movement. And this aside, this anti-fascism, anti-occupation dilemma aside, all Serbian textbooks and some historians try to underestimate the 1941 that in 1941 on 12th of November, Draža Mihailović actually met with German officials of the occupied Serbia in village Divci near the city of Valjevo, where he asked the Germans if they would give him arms and ammunition to fight the communism, fight the communists, and the Germans did not want to give him ammo and weapons if he didn't say that he is on the German side publicly, and that is why that is why they had no agreement right then. But it is important to note that Mihailović said in that instance that he cannot openly fight. He cannot openly state that he is on the German anti-communist side because the Serbian people would not join his ranks anymore. So, 1941 aside, the modern Serbian historiography, a part of modern Serbian historiography and the textbooks go silently over the fact that in August 1944, Dragoljub Mihailović and the leader of the government, the puppet government of the occupied Serbia, Milan Nedić, General Milan Nedić, ex-general of Yugoslav army, who was now a Quisling in Serbia. They had an agreement in village of Ražani, also in Western Serbia, where they called openly for gathering of national forces against the communist threat. That is, August 1944, almost a month before King Peter II, who was in exile in London, called for all the patriotic forces to stand with the partisan movement and the communists and to go over from Draža to Tito. So those two facts, among many others, that prove the connection between the German occupation forces and their puppets, Nedić's government, and the Chetniks, are silently looked over, are ignored by those historians with a tendency to show that the Chetniks were actually passive but anti-fascist movement during the whole duration of the war. The narrative goes that Dragoljub Mihailović didn't want to fight the Germans because of the possible repercussions. 100 people shot for one killed German soldier in Serbia, and 50 people shot if Serb wounds German soldier. So the story goes that he went to a town in Montenegro, stayed passive there, and waited for an Allied rescue and an Allied invasion of Dalmatian coast. An Allied invasion of Dalmatian coast that is another topic, because it is alive in the imagination of the Serbian revisionist school. Let's call it that way, because one historian that fought against revision said humorously once that the Allies couldn't decide where to invade the so important beaches of Normandy that would lead them to Paris, or even more important, shores of Adriatic Sea that would lead them to mountains, Bileća, Gatsko, and Foča. All those towns have like 5,000 people and no symbolic meaning to the Allied cause. Moving forward, we will talk about Nedić and his place in Serbian public now. Milan Nedić was a general of the Yugoslav army before the World War II. During the World War II, in August, he decided to form the government of national savior that was actually a government in which he sided with the Germans and sided occupied Serbia with the Germans. So he had a right to have armed troops in Serbia that were to keep the uprising extinguished and to fight any partisan resistance in Serbia. The interesting thing is that people now here in Serbia deny his role in the Holocaust, even though it is known that his officials actually took part in prescribing the Jews, giving those lists to Gestapo, and making Belgrade the first Judenfrei, where the term was also coined, the first Judenfrei city of these parts of Europe. Later on, he staged anti-Semitic, anti-communistic, and anti-Masonic exhibitions around Serbia, in Belgrade and all the major cities. And the thing he did, and the thing that the Serbian revisionists are so talkative about, is that he received all those tens of thousands refugees from the independent state of Croatia. The main argument of the revisionist school is that Nedić understood that the new European order was to be created by Germany, and that he just wanted to save the biological substance, quote unquote, of the Serbian people, and that he wanted to promote a non-communistic, non-capitalistic, but rather an unique, endemic Serbian village ideology with some kinds of joint households on the Serbian countryside. That was an anti-industrial and anti-modernistic angle of Nedić's ideology. Next to Nedić, it was Dimitrij Ljotić, who was an ideologue of a Serbian endemic version of fascism. That is, it is called now Ljotićevstvo, or after the name of his party, Zbor. It is a mixture, actually, of fascism, this peasant ideology, and orthodoxy, and it was supported by later sanctified Bishop Nikolai Velimirović, who was later an immigrant in the USA, and that will be a later topic of this paper. Nowadays, we can talk a bit later when I talk about rehabilitation of the World War II war criminals. But let's not talk about the partisans. The partisans have a lot of controversy now between the revisionism, and the first controversy comes with the first bullet that was shot in World War II in Serbia. The first bullet of the uprising. It was in July 1941 when a man called Žikica Jovanović Španac, or the Spaniard, because he was earlier in his life he fought in the Spanish Civil War. He shot two policemen of the Acimović, which was part of the Nedić regime, in a Serbian village, and that was the beginning of the communist uprising in central Serbia, or Serbia proper. Nowadays, this is mentioned only to say that Žikica Jovanović Španac, he didn't kill the participants in an occupational regime, but rather he killed two Serbs. And this is taken as an example of a communist idea or a plan to make Serbs fight and kill themselves in that squabble and that civil war. So the Serbian Orthodox Church had a part in it, in that village where the shooting took place, in Bela Crkva. They built a kind of a memorial to the two policemen of the Acimović regime, thus rehabilitating the people that were in German service in the beginning of the occupation of Serbia. Later on, the biggest thing that revisionist historiography insists on are the March negotiations of 1943, when Đilas, Velebit, and Milovan Đilas, Vladimir Velebit, and Koča Popović of the partisan movement negotiated with the Germans. The revisionist historiography actually says that this was a prime example of a communist collaboration with the Germans, even though a 1985 study shows that the March negotiations were a tactical move by the partisan leadership to buy time for the main part of the partisan army that was fighting the Germans and Ustasha and the Chetniks and the Italians in the Battle of Neretva. It was they tried to buy time and try to make partisans an accepted side of war in 1943, which they were not. They were considered bandits, and therefore they couldn't be captured by the Germans, and so they were automatically killed when they were captured to that date. And one of the most popular topics are not the victims of war, but the victims of so-called revolutionary terror, or the post-war terror of the communist regime in Yugoslavia and in Serbia in particular. This search for the people killed in post-war terror is fully institutionalized. Actually, in 2009, two commissions were formed. First, the one that searched for the death remains of Dragoljub Draža Mihajlović, who was sentenced to death in 1946 and killed after a death sentence. That state commission failed to find Mihajlović's body, and it was shut down after a fiasco when they said that they have found Dragoljub Mihajlović's body, but a forensic examination of the bones has shown that the bones were of a pig. Later on, a new state commission was founded, and it was the target of this commission was to find and mark all the secret graveyards, the secret mass tombs of those who were shot after the liberation of 1944. This commission operated and made an internet database on this topic, but it also culminated in an exhibition in the Historical Museum of Serbia, led by the leader of this government work group, Srđan Cvetković, which was called In the Name of the People, U ime naroda, which showed some dubious numbers about the killings after the war. The numbers were around 90,000 killed in Cvetković's estimate, even though he didn't note where the people were killed, and he didn't remove the double names, the two people that are found in sources as dead. The one man that is found in two sources as dead, he counted that one person as two persons. He didn't remove the double names, and knowingly has given to the public the higher number than the actual number of the victims is. A great part of that number, around 60 to 70%, are actually German and Hungarian nationals from Vojvodina, and not the so-called Serbian countrymen or Serbian villagers that are beatified by this school of thought in Serbian historiography. And now I would like to talk about the legal side of the things. The first step was also undertaken during after the democratic changes and the fall of Milosevic in the year 2000. On the 21st of December 2004, the Serbian parliament made the law that changed the law that regarded the veterans and the members of veteran families, in which they equalized partisans and Chetniks. Both partisans, Chetniks, and the members of their family could receive now the equal amount of state help and pensions. This was a huge hit, actually, because the state now proclaimed what was the right side in the World War II, and not the historiographical, facts. The state prescribed that the partisans and Chetniks were actually equally anti-fascists, and that they equally deserve the pensions. Interesting thing to note is that the partisans that have risen in 1941 already received a so-called partisan memorial, which was a memorial given by the state, which ensured some rights and privileges to those who took the rifle first. And now, in 2004, 60 years after the war, they made up a Ravna Gora memorial for the Chetniks that fought in 1941. Ravna Gora is after the mountain where the Chetniks gathered and proclaimed their uprising in 1941. 2 years after that, a year and a half after that, on 17th of April of 2006, a new law was proposed and brought to life by the Serbian parliament, and that was the law on rehabilitation. The rehabilitation of the people who were charged and put to trial by the communist regime after the World War II. The law was to make those trials defunct, and those people who were sentenced unsentenced. And a few people were unsentenced by Serbian courts after this, in blatantly political processes where the historians that were called to justify lied before the court and were not even afraid to admit it after the hearings. So Dragoljub Draža Mihajlović was rehabilitated by the court. He is now considered unsentenced by the Serbian law. After that, before that, Knez Pavle was rehabilitated. The leader of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia before the military coup of late March 1941, who was the brain behind Yugoslavia's joining of the Axis. And one of the Dragoljub Mihajlovic's most prominent helpers, Nikola Kalabić, was also rehabilitated by the municipal court in Valjevo, but on the higher instance, that rehabilitation of that well-documented war criminal, the rehabilitation is stopped for now until it goes to even a higher judicial instance. But the rehabilitation is alive and well in Serbia, and the public sphere is talking about the process of rehabilitation of Milan Nedić, which would be the first non-Chetnik to be rehabilitated. And the main argument is that he was forced to do everything he did in the World War II, which is a commonplace in every Quisling defense. The process is now stopped, to surprise of all of us, but we'll see what will happen in the future. If Milan Nedić gets rehabilitated, which is not a question of law, but a question of politics, we could see some serious repercussions in the image of Serbia as an anti-fascist country that is built upon the principles of Avnoj in 1943, or or its socialist past in 1945 to 1990. And I just wanted to say that I saw a survey on the internet that was wide-scaled, and I was quite shocked to see that Serbia placed 4th most anti-Semitic country in Europe nowadays, with 42% of people answering some questions that could discern an anti-Semite as answering those questions anti-Semitically. So I just wanted to say that this anti-Semitism is in close connection with the ideologies of Nedić, Ljotić, and the before mentioned Nikolai Velimirović. The question of Nikolai Velimirović is actually the topic of a few minutes. I won't take long. I see that I am short of time. Nikolai Velimirović was a bishop before the World War II who open-handedly embraced the white emigration from the Soviet Union in the early 20s and early 30s. There he had an anti-Semitic journal, and during the World War II, he openly supported Nedić and Ljotić, and went with the Serbian patriarch Gavrilo Dožić to Dachau, where he wasn't in the concentration camp, but in a camp for internation, where he wrote the next lines, that all modern creeds of Europe are created by the Jews who crucified Christ. They have invented democracy, socialism, strike, and atheism, tolerance of all religions, pacifism, worldwide revolution, capitalism, and communism. All of the aforementioned things are the inventions of the Jews and their father, the devil. This would be just an example of an anti-Semitic, fascist, pro-Hitler thinker in the 40s in Europe. But Nikolai emigrated to America, where he became the most popular figure in the Serbian emigration in Chicago and around it. And after that, in 1992, when Yugoslavia was in the state of collapse, his remains returned to Serbia, were welcomed by the regime and the opposition, and after that, shortly after that, he was sanctified by the Serbian Orthodox Church and consequently by the Orthodox Church. So, by becoming a saint, it is sort of a taboo in Serbia to talk about the anti-Semitism of Nikolai Velimirović and the people that he supported. And one close account to Nikolai says that he prayed every day for the 3 Serbian martyrs, Draža, Dragoljub Mihajlović, Dimitrije Ljotić, and Milan Nedić. So the 3 sides of Serbian nationalism, one, a monarchistic nationalism of Draža, pro-German nationalism of Nedić, and clero-fascist nationalism of Ljotić, are now defended by the most prominent modern saint of the Serbian Church. And I see that my time is out. I won't bother you with these internal problems anymore. I just wanted to make a quick recap, and we can talk about it later. Sorry, Jurica, if I made some problem in schedule with this. And we will hear each other when I put Professor Stojanović's paper online.
Well, no problems at all. Thank you, Vukašin, for this pretty interesting stuff. So unfortunately, no questions for you. Let me just check. Oh, there it is. There it is. We have a question again by Jonathan Fennell from King's College, who seems to be our savior at this moment. And the question for Vukašin is, could you talk about the danger of politicians using the historical memory of the Second World War to support their policies more generally? And could you link your paper to experiences in other countries?
Well, of course, because I will talk about the most contemporary usage of the most contemporary use of the World War II memory in Serbian politics. The two parties that are now in power in Serbia are the Serbian Progressive Party of Aleksandar Vučić and the ex-Milošević party, Serbian Socialist Party, led by Ivica Dačić. Aleksandar Vučić is, I think, the brain behind the idea of rehabilitation of Milan Nedić. To him, there is no question about Dragoljub Mihajlović, because Vučić was a part of Chetnik revival in the 90s, and there is no question about it whether he thinks that the Chetniks were the good guys in the World War II. The thing is that he tries he is trying to present himself as a new Serbian leader that is forced to cooperate with the outside forces that could destroy Serbia. He wants to present himself as a man that must take serious and hard deals with the former enemy to save the biological substance of the people. And consequentially, you see where I'm going. The rehabilitation of Nedić is actually coming from the current need of our establishment to somehow justify the negotiation with Kosovo, the negotiation with the European Union, as a necessity, and that Nedić recognized the Germans. He knew that they were the enemy, but he saved the people. Vučić now tried to present the West as the former enemy, but that we must cooperate with them, like Nedić cooperated with the Germans to save the Serbian people. The prime thing, the central thing, is fear, and the other thing is he tries to present the West both as an enemy but as a necessary ally in the future. That is just my opinion, but I think that the Nedić rehabilitation stems from that idea of collaboration, and I have read some articles that are historically popular on some internet pages that are run by the party, not officially, but they are, that justify Nedić's action in the World War II. So if Nedić could, so why wouldn't Vučić? And the other part of the coin is the Socialist Party of Serbia that wants to mobilize those 6 to 7% of Serbian people that are still think that the primary anti-fascist force of Serbia in World War II were the partisans. They try to mobilize them to vote for them by keeping that communist socialist image their newest motto is part of the national anthem of Yugoslavia. They have a red star on their logo, and so on and so on. That is the two fronts. One tries to mobilize Serbian voters through Nedić rhetoric rather than iconography, and the other ruling party by the iconography of Nedić's prime enemies, the communists. And the second part was, excuse me, you're muted, Jurica.
Yeah, I know. The second question was if you,
European context, yes.
If you could link your paper to experiences in other countries.
I tend to believe that this populist international from Visegrad Group, Croatia, Serbia, the whole Balkans, and now Italy, that it has ties. That first and foremost, it stems from the narrative of two totalitarianisms. It stems from the signs from the equalization of Nazis and fascists to communists, and now all those anti-communists in Eastern Europe are not those democratic anti-communist communists that are known in a Western European tradition, like in France and in Britain. Here in Eastern Europe, we don't have democratic anti-communists. Those anti-communists in Eastern Europe and in Southeastern Europe that go and follow that Brussels II totalitarianism's agenda actually are the anti-communists that cherish and follow the same or slightly altered ideologies of fascists and collaborators in Eastern Europe and in Balkans. So anti-communists in Croatia are not the conservative or the Labour Party, but rather Ustasha. And in Serbia, anti-communists are the people who are supporting Nedić and Orthodox clerofascism. In Germany, not in Germany, in Hungary, they support or justify Horthy, and so on and so on. And I think that this Eastern European context and Southeastern European context isn't the same regarding anti-communism as that in the West. That would be my quick answer.
Well, Jonathan, hopefully you're satisfied with the answers you received. Thank you, Vukašin, for your time.
No problem.
Thank you for prolonging your speech time, so I have a bit less.
I didn't look at the clock, and
yeah, history just takes you away.
Excuse me.
You know how it is.
I sincerely apologize.
Yeah, no offense, no offense. Anyways, I would like to continue where Vukašin stopped, and it's basically only a few kilometers to the west. As it is, we'll have to go just a little bit back in history in order to show some patterns which are well known to most of us. In Croatia, there were always those who thought independence from a major force or a state who ruled over them. Most of the time in history, that was someone's blowing into the microphone. Anyways, for the most of the time, few hundred years, that was the case with Habsburg monarchy. Later, that was the which later became Austro-Hungarian Empire. And after the end of World War I, when Austro-Hungarian Empire saw its demise, most of those who wanted independence for Croatia realized that basically the only way for the nation to become even remotely independent was to join their strength with the Serbian politicians and the Serbs, who were also at the time more than just a significant minority, actually, on territory of Croatia. That way, only a few years afterwards, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, or First Yugoslavia, as created under the rule of Serbian nationality. And once again, the people of Croatia were basically under foreign rule, but this time it was actually pretty bad for them. So what we can see from just a few years before the Second World War, is that there rose a generation of nationalists, which is up to some extent understandable. However, what followed most certainly is not understandable and shouldn't be by any way. So it was basically that amount of time, those 23 years, where most of the paradigms which regarded towards Serbs, the hatred towards them created. And as we heard a bit earlier, all of it escalated in 1941 when Ustaša regime came to power. Unfortunately, that seed which was planted a few years ago fell up the soil of nationalism, which was rising throughout the whole of Europe. Anyways, that hatred, I believe we could say so, was greatly diminished after the war, and I would say that there are basically two reasons for that. First of all, we have the major ethnicity, which liberated the whole territory of Yugoslavia from the Germans, the Italians, and Ustaša, or Ustaša and their collaborators, helpers, were the Serbs. So the second major ethnicity that participated in the partisan were the Croats, and this percent by only a few percent. I have in memory particular documents with 54 Serbs and 12 a single combat group somewhere in Slavonia in 1942. And in 1943, the ratio came to almost 1-to-1. So basically, we had 50 Serbs and 49 Croats in the same combat group. And this is a pattern which is perfectly traceable through the archive materials and such. And such was the case with most of the other combat groups, actually. And what I would like to state at the moment is that this basically shows the exact pattern of what Professor Hutinec was talking about, how the Ustaša, the regime themselves, created their own nemesis or enemies. So both nations fought along each other against the common enemy, and that's reason number one. Reason number two would be some things which came afterwards when the war ended, with rebuilding the whole state which was devastated by the war. And that's the idea of bratstvo i jedinstvo, or brotherhood and unity, of many ethnicities that actually made Yugoslavia what it is. This was basically a socialist paradigm created in the spirit of socialism or communism. And it was created during the war, which meant all of the people in Yugoslavia, Slovenians, Croats, Serbs, Montenegros, Macedonians, and there was also a significant Muslim minority in Bosnia, that they could all live together in harmony, and that it's exactly what brotherhood and unity was all about. And this actually functioned very well until President Tito died in 1980s. 1980 exactly. What followed was basically a whole decade, as we heard Vukašin say, of rising tensions, which were fueled mostly by extreme nationalism. On Croatian side, well, I wouldn't say mostly, but much to the effort of remnants of the Ustaša emigration, of whom there was still a significant number left. They were mostly in Argentina, but still. Anyways, that escalated in the 90s with the war and the whole story about the war. Now, what I would like to comment is, or ask, is what elements differ the Croatian case of negationism and historical revisionism from the Serbian. After all, in the background of both of those processes, there's an immense and I would say criminal process of historical revisionism, but also negationism, which was probably unseen in history. The, let's say so, open flirting with fascism and the Ustaša symbols during the war in the 90s. That's where the whole story of whole modern part of this revisionism story began. It is, after all, more than clear who was the aggressor in the 90s, but still, the first president of Croatia, Franjo Tuđman, who was also a partisan general in World War II, never really sought to take a firm stance against using such iconography during the 90s. But still, this was not as epidemic as it is today. That's where the seed of the process we're witnessing today was planted, and only afterwards this became basically our regularity. Once again, after the war was won and Croatia finally got its independence, almost no attempts were made to change this newly found paradigm, to say so. To the contrary, I would say that that's when it began. This whole process continued even worse, and it blossomed until this day without any problems. Now, first of all, now we're going to talk a bit about some particular cases of revisionism. First of all, in order to completely erase the almost half a century of Yugoslavia era of Croatia, there was a thorough, to say so, damnatio memoriae, or damnation memoriae, was done, which means that basically all the names of the streets and squares were changed into those who the ruling party thought was appropriate. Busts and statues of partisan fighters were removed. The whole story basically ended with even some highly ranked Ustaša officials, such as Mile Budak, getting their own streets named after them. The infamous Ustaša butcher Jure Francetić received his memorial in his birthplace. And lately, we're witnessing the largest wave of this revisionism and negationism, basically due to the fact that extreme right is slowly but surely, I'm afraid, taking over Croatia. Now, first of all, we had the case of placing an HOS division memorial in the town of Jasenovac, which by itself, basically, that's not a problem. As we're talking of a division who suffered terrible losses during the war in the 90s, and they really gave their share to liberating the occupied parts of Croatia. The problem is, however, the fact they openly used Ustaša iconography, especially they had black uniforms. They used Ustaša greeting or battle cry, Za dom spremni, which means for fatherland, ready for the fatherland. And it's right there on the memorial in the town that was basically the capital of Holocaust in Croatia, which caused a lot of problems. The whole story got a lot of publicity, both positive and negative. And in the end, the memorial was moved to another town in Croatia, in Novska, which is near Sisak. And what concerns me most, and probably a lot of other people, what concerns us the most is the fact that this solution of removing the memorial to another town was a solution given by the government itself, which only shows the problem. You see the problem. That is not, just a second, that the problem is that they weren't ready to, how to say it, they were not ready to fight against such state of affairs. They just simply decided to remove the memorial to a place which wouldn't cause that much publicity, and much more less about it wasn't anymore about the men who gave their lives to defend Croatia. And nobody actually rose the question of why was it even allowed to them to use the Ustaša iconography during the war. So it's not about the memorial, as I said. It's much more or less about the men who died and for who the memorial was, but it's actually about what was written on it and why was that specific battle cry allowed in the first place during the war in the 90s. Nowadays, there's a lot of argument regarding the battle cry Za dom spremni, and the extreme right most often defends it as an old Croatian traditional cry, of which, of course, there's absolutely no proof or evidence. The claim is basically a total nonsense. But even if it was an old traditional battle cry of Croat people, it certainly got solid during the World War II and its usage by Ustaša regime. So once again, its usage should have been prohibited and should be prohibited now. But it remained unprohibited at the moment, and I have absolutely no reason to believe it's going to change anytime soon. Now, furthermore, the negation we're talking about is taking its run at the culture also. So the first recent example I'm going to talk about is a book by Igor Vukić called Radni logor Jasenovac, which translates as Labor Camp Jasenovac, which basically even in its title shows what's the point of the whole book. As you've probably noticed during the lecture by Professor Hutinec, it was not only a labor camp, if at all. Especially if we are to consider the definition of a labor camp. For instance, the German Nazi regime organized their concentration plus labor camps in near the factories or something. Basically, there was no efficient, let's say so, labor in Ustaša camps. There was no production, to support the war efforts. It was basically, just gathering a lot of people around to be able to kill them. So it's preposterous, actually, the very idea of this book, which is to show that Jasenovac was in fact a labor camp and not a killing site, which without any doubt it actually was. And to make things worse, the book got presented live on national television program as some sort of a new view or a paradigm changer of the topic, which is basically insane. Next thing I'm going to mention is a movie by Jakov Sedlar, Croatian movie maker, which is called Jasenovac Istina, that is Jasenovac the Truth. At its core, it consists of a lot of manipulated sources, which is the main weapon of modern Croatian revisionists and negationists. And it's the bad kind of revisionism, actually its main goal is to minimize the atrocities done by the Ustaša regime. As we all know, basically the very job of historians is historical revision, but not when it takes a turn or a jump, a leap into negationism. Well, that is the whole point of science, basically. So once again, Jasenovac, this was another try to show Jasenovac more as some sort of a ghetto, just a transition point between Nazi death camps and labor camps, as if that wasn't terrible enough. So they're not showing Jasenovac what it really was. Of course, no one so far even tried to argue the very existence of the camp. I would like to see that. But however, it's what happened inside the fence and the walls of the camp that they're trying to manipulate. And unfortunately, they're doing so without any restrictions or boundaries. Another one I'm going to mention today is the Slovenian writer Roman Leljak, who recently published his book, which to me honestly seems to be the most radical of all we mentioned above. So the book and the movie called The Myth of Jasenovac directly imply that not more than 1,500 people died, and I quote, died, not got killed, but died during the time the camp was functional and operational. And simply to disprove this nonsense, it would be enough to take a closer look at, well, basically anything regarding Jasenovac, especially, for instance, the aerial reconnaissance photos of Jasenovac taken by the United States Air Force during the war, in which you can clearly see the mass graves around the camp. And Leljak even goes a step further, calling the whole story around Jasenovac a myth, basically, implying that everything regarding Jasenovac was basically just, a clever plan, which exaggerated by Yugoslav Secret Service, the UDBA, UDBA, in order to keep the Croats in line and in order, which once again is a complete and utter nonsense. Not to mention the parts where he mentions that concerts were held inside the camp, or how they ate pretty well. So basically just one short, simple visit to any Croatian archive and searching for just a single document regarding living in Jasenovac, or whether it's Ustaša or pre-war, after-war, I don't know, a document will show that basically everything written in this book is complete and utter nonsense. Now to go back just a little bit in history, that is back to the arguments which are most often used by modern negationists. And first of all, we have the Bleiburg and Križni Put events, which occurred at the end of the war in 1945. Those two terms basically mean the retaliations by the partisan forces against or over the defeated Ustaša regime soldiers. And the main paradigm of modern negationists and extreme right activists is that this was a plain example of everything Yugoslav was being anti-Croatian, that only the Croatian people and Croats got shot and killed, that women and children were slaughtered, which is not true, especially if you take into consideration that the Ustaša were not the only targets. of those retaliations, but rather every possible enemy, including the remaining Germans, the Chetnik forces, Nedićevci, and even Cossacks, what remained of them, were victims of the events occurred at Bleiburg and Križni Put. And what you also have to know is that even as the Russians took photos of themselves in the Berlin and everywhere throughout Germany, while they celebrated victory in Europe, Americans celebrated VE Day. It was almost a whole month until the last shot was fired in Croatia on this soil, and the last of Ustaša surrendered. So practically, we would have to move the VE Day for almost a whole month, because the war officially ended by the fall of the German Nazi regime. But if we're to stay, true to the facts, that means that war in Europe ended a month later, and it ended in Croatia. And second of all, as one of the main arguments by modern negationists and revisionists, is the role and actually the trial, the Stepinac trial, and the role which Catholic Church played during, and even more important, after the World War II. Now, first of all, there were these certain groups of Ustaša who managed to escape, and they pillaged around, they hid in forests, and they were helped mostly by the church and the Catholic priests. They plotted on destroying the newly founded Yugoslav state, and of course the Yugoslav army had to deal with them. Those were the cases of so-called Križari, most of which gathered in Austria. But still, a lot of them evaded capture and remained basically active, and this is the part where one has to question the role that Catholic Church had not only after World War II, but also during the World War II. And this is exactly why the Stepinac trial even occurred. Stepinac was here the symbol of Catholic Church during the independent state of Croatia, and his trial and his death remain by this day an argument for extreme right parties to show that the same old paradigm, that everything regarding Yugoslavia, second Yugoslavia, was anti-Croatian, which once again I have to deem basically stupid. Well, because everything they want second Yugoslavia to be was basically the first Yugoslav state, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Almost everything they wanted to be. So instead of focusing on Second World War and denying the role that the partisan movement played in the anti-fascist efforts of whole Europe, they should focus their efforts, their vast efforts, on the first Yugoslavia, which would serve to them basically as an example of what they're trying to show. The second Yugoslavia was most definitely wasn't as they say, the dungeon of the people. So why all of this? This is all actually because we have this completely wrong paradigm of viewing the war of the 90s through the prism of what happened in 1945. And that is a great mistake, especially since 1945 and 1990 have absolutely nothing in common. The war that was waged during the 90s, that was the war against the Serbian nationalism of Slobodan Milošević, who used, among others, the very Yugoslav army as its own toy. So that wasn't the war against socialism, and most certainly and especially not the war against whole of Yugoslavia or whole people of Serbia and Serbian people. And until we get rid of such a paradigm, which unfortunately I believe seems more and more unlikely by day, the negationism will blossom. For now, we have those few books and few movies, but still the pressure is immense. And as I said, it's all because of completely wrong perception of the events during the 90s, and which led basically to the fact that we now have a completely wrong perception of an era of 45 years of socialist Yugoslavia. And I would stop now. Let me just check if there are, by some miracle, any questions. Yeah, again, a question from Jonathan. What role should the historian play in contemporary politics? Well, well, that's an awesome one. Basically, in case of Croatia, historians already played their role. I mean, if you want to, you have a whole palette of books, works, papers done by famous and recognized Croatian historians who condemn everything that's happening, but it does not reach the public, the society. And but still we have to try. And I'm really glad to say that we now have a major work published by Professor Ivo Goldstein about Jasenovac, which came right at the perfect time. It got published at the perfect time, since Jasenovac became now the next target of Croatian negationists and historical revisionists and Holocaust deniers. So basically, what we as historians can offer is to fight back and to organize more of such events to let the whole world know what's going on. And I believe by now we're finished. Anyways, this is more or less everything we have to say for now. Thank you very much for following. Thank you, Professor Hutinec and Vukašin, for participating. I hope to see more from both of you. I hope you enjoyed it as much as you could, and I recommend you, as a true YouTuber, to subscribe to the channel, as we'll have much more going on in this group. And we're currently planning the next series of the workshops, which will most probably regard the good old tough military history. We're going to talk about battlefields in the Balkans, and we'll keep you updated here and via social accounts of the Second World War Research Group. Thank you all once again for following, and I bid you all farewell and good night.
Right.